Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And we're going for a trip around the world today, Ginny. Right after this. Around the world in 18 minutes.
That was not bad. That was not a bad segue at all. That was one of your better ones.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm disappointed in myself. I feel like I need to get under a much lower bar.
Yeah, well, the bar was already pretty low.
I know, but that's why I want to go under it. when I clear that bar, I'm very disappointed in myself. Yes.
Not bad.
Yes.
Not bad at all.
No. We are talking about agencies operating internationally, having international clients, having international employees, partnering with agencies internationally, having an international office, all of those different things, because there are a lot of agencies in the world today that look around and say, hey, everything's global. Maybe I should be too.
Yeah. And it's not, in today's world with remote working and technology the way that it is, it's not hard to do. There are some things you have to think about. There are some cultural differences, but it is something that can easily be done in today's world.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of those things where you just need to figure out what you're willing to do, what you're able to do, and then understanding what those impacts, as you say, are. What are the gotchas, if you will, of operating in different places, and are you willing to do what needs to be done in order to address it? So let's start talking about a few of those things. And so why don't we start with one that is pretty common or more common today for agencies, which is employing help overseas. So having contractors who are in other countries, typically. And so this is a question that I've been asked by a number of clients over the last year because, the U.S. job market is very difficult right now. And so hiring contractors or employees is very difficult for many agencies. And so they look around and they say, hey, Eastern Europe, Central America, the Philippines, there's lots of people out there I hear about that I can go out and hire. What do I need to be thinking about?
Yeah, and I have done in all of those locations, had employees. Well, I wouldn't say employees because it's really challenging to hire employees. So what we've done is, 1099 contractors. So we've hired everything.
Except you don't 1099 them because they're overseas. So.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So from our perspective, they're contractors, but yeah, it's different depending on where they are. And it depends, right? It depends on where they are. It depends on their culture. It depends on their society. It depends on all of the rules and regulations that they have. Typically, they don't tend to be as strict as we are in the U.S. So that's good because you're going from some place that's really strict and highly regulated to places that are not as. So it makes it a little bit easier. But you definitely do have to understand, all of the things that go into that and how people are paid. Like, for instance, in Canada, you have to add a VAT tax on top of what you pay. So, there are things like that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you are working inside different countries. But, just like we say at the end of every episode, it depends on which country it is and what the kind of work that you're trying to do, on how it works. I personally like to use things like Upwork because they have it all figured out, and then you can hire experts based on what you need. But I've also had what I would consider full-time employees handling things like content and social media. So.
Yeah, and it is, there's a lot of different ways to go about it using a service like Upwork or one of the offshoring agencies that are out there that can help, facilitate these arrangements. In a lot of these countries specifically, there are businesses set up where they essentially are almost, they're effectively the local employer. You're hiring them and they're really just sort of a country-specific middleman, if you will. My experience, though, is that most agencies just ask forgiveness rather than permission, at least as you get more off the beaten path with countries. Canada's a little bit different. Western Europe would be a little bit different. But once you start dealing with Eastern Europe, Central America, Asia, a lot of folks just send the money and kind of hope that it never comes back to bite them.
Right.
in part because it's very difficult and, frankly, not cheap in order to figure out what all the rules and regulations are in those places if you're doing it directly. So I am certainly not endorsing the ask forgiveness, not permission, but I can tell you that it's incredibly common when people are hiring directly in some of these locations. So that's something to think about. The other thing to think about, though, is when you're hiring in these areas, how is it going to be different from hiring someone local to you or in your own country? And so you've already cited cultural differences, right? There are,
Mhm.
in some parts of the world, when you hire people, they are very unlikely to question you. They're unlikely to push back if you make a suggestion that's maybe not the best one. Whereas in the US, a lot of times it's pretty easy to get an employee to say, no, that's just dumb. I'm not doing that, right? There are a lot of cultures out there where you may be hiring overseas and they may just take whatever you say as gospel and run with it. If that's what you want, great. If you want someone who's going to push back and offer some contrary advice, that may not be what you get in some of these locations. So you really need to understand sort of those kinds of nuances. So if you're going into an area where you haven't worked with folks there before, talk to people who have and understand, because there are some places where if you tell someone climb a hill, you have to tell them here are the 10 steps,
Right.
and they will follow the 10
They
steps.
will. Yes.
Exactly. And they will do a
Yes.
great job following those
Yes.
10 steps. If they
Yes.
get to step 8 and they think, this isn't a good idea, they're going to step 9 anyway.
Right.
Right. So you need to think those things through. And it's something where I have hired help in basically every part of the world over the last 20 years. And you really need to know those things because it impacts how you specify the work to them, how you manage them, and frankly, the result that you can expect to get from it.
Yeah. And I would also say you have to be cognizant of the fact that many countries have much better family leave plans than we do, policies than we do, and they have better paid time off policies than we do. So when you hire somebody, especially from Canada or Western Europe, they're accustomed to a certain amount of time off, like a full month in August. And they're accustomed to a year off from maternity leave, where we do maybe 6 weeks with just short-term disability, right? So you certainly were the country is trying to change that here, but that's not where we are yet. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that those things are very culturally sound in their countries, and you have to be aware. So if you're going to offer that for your international employees, you have to offer it for your domestic employees as well.
And things you might never think of, like the logistics of payment, that can be
Right.
very different in some countries.
Yep.
There are a lot of places that you might not even think would be this way, but you cannot send a check and you can't send a wire transfer. You're going to have to find a different way to transmit funds to those individuals. And so you need to think about those things in advance and just make sure that you're setting yourself up properly so that you can actually pay people in a timely fashion.
Yeah, I remember the first time somebody said, I can't get a payment that way. And I was like, but you're halfway around the world. How am I going to pay you? PayPal. I was like, oh, okay. Right. Which is strange to me that I would send somebody's paycheck through PayPal, but that's how we did it.
And this is true even in some Western developed countries.
It is.
This is we're not talking about, off the beaten path islands in the middle of the Pacific that have no electricity or something like that. I mean, this is places you just would not think of not having the access to the same banking tools that we have here, but that's the case. And you need to make sure that you're understanding that particularly if you're going to be hiring one-on-one, which is why it's often better if you can work through some sort of an intermediary, whether it is country specific or whether it is global like Upwork or something like that. So, kind of factor those things in. The last thing I would say from an employee standpoint, and it's a good segue over onto other aspects of working internationally, is how you deal with time zones. And so you need to be thoughtful about how the time zones affect the contractors that you're working with overseas. You need to think about how it impacts clients, right? So this is something that really does go across other things. And so you need to think about what you're willing to do from a time perspective and what those team members are willing to do as well. There are some times where you may have an employee in a particular country who is actually trying to get work in the U.S. because they're happy to work nights, right? Maybe it works better for their family situation. So you need to understand what their expectations are regarding time zones, what your expectations are, and make sure there's a mesh, because that's really important from an employee standpoint. But as we transition on to the client aspect of working internationally, it's really important there as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And trying to figure out what works for everyone. But, I would say that works in the U.S. too, especially if you're using contractors. Like I have a brilliant content producer that I use. She's fantastic, but she has a full-time job. So she does stuff for nights and weekends for us. I have to be okay with that if I want to continue to work with her. And I do. So, you have to find out those things where you're flexible. with your international contractors and employees, because you're right. This as you bring in clients into the mix that are international, they're going to have different expectations on your time zones as well.
Right. And it's not just time zones, it's holidays and things like that too, right?
Yep.
Different cultures have different holidays. And so understanding that, you have clients who, if you're here in the US, they're going to be open on Thanksgiving, right?
Right.
Is that okay? Like, do you have a plan to deal with that? Is the work that you're doing not dependent upon you being available that day, or is it? And so, you need to plan for those kinds of things, and you need to plan ahead for those kinds of things so it doesn't come as a surprise to a client who, frankly, isn't aware when American Thanksgiving
No,
is.
they are not.
Any more than most listeners to this podcast in the U.S. have any idea even when Canadian Thanksgiving is
Just
or was? Yes,
right.
that's why I use that particular example,
because it just happened.
Because the Canadian border is only a couple hours north of us,
right,
as
right.
it is for you as well. So,
I laughed when you said that, because a couple of years ago we had just started working with a UK client. We've got this all figured out now, but we had just started working with them when we had fallback daylight savings.
Right.
And we had a meeting scheduled, and it was the same meeting every Monday, but we had fallen back and they do not. So we didn't show up for the meeting on time.
Well, they do, but it's 1 week difference.
It's
to make your life absolutely miserable.
Totally
It's not like they never fall back. They do. It's just not the same weekend. Yeah. So it just really messes you up for like 3 weeks. So, as you're trying to figure it out, and then you finally settle back on it. But there are countries that don't change, right? And so, when you're trying to deal with that becomes a challenge as well. But you have that even in the U.S. There are some states that do not observe Arizona. And I used to do a lot of work with people in Arizona, and that was a nightmare, because we'd all of a sudden have meetings that if we had agreed on a certain time, that time was changing, which is why, particularly if you're doing international work, use shared calendar invites, because that then handles those things and it will move it around on your schedule. You're still going to have problems, but at least that problem is probably not that you showed up at the wrong time. It's probably that you now have an overlap on a meeting somewhere else that didn't move at the same time.
Yeah.
Etc. So time zones are really important in understanding how those impact things, because it can be really great to say, hey, yes, I'd love to work with this, fancy fashion brand in Italy. Okay, great. Understand what that means from a time zone difference. Can you do the work in the overlapping window that you have available? Do you need to work outside hours? Because if it's a client, you're the one who's going to have to sacrifice generally,
right.
Not them. But that's an honest conversation you need to have in the process with them before they become a client, so how big of an issue is this going to be? Are you going to need to have me at 7 a.m. every day, which is 1 a.m. my time?
Right.
Okay, that's
a problem.
Are you cool with that or not?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you are. Maybe you're a night owl. Maybe you want to be up at 1 a.m.
Yeah. I am not, and I just recently told a client no, that I was not meeting with them at 2:30 in the morning. But I would say, for the most part, at least based on my experience, especially in Western Europe, they're accustomed to working with East Coast companies. So if you're on Eastern time or even Central time, which is what I am, it's pretty doable. I mean, you start working with them at 2 or 3 o'clock p.m. their time, and they go late. They go until 6 or 7 p.m. So they're pretty. Most of them, especially if they're larger, are accustomed to working East Coast time with Americans. So it's not as big of a deal. But yeah, I literally just had somebody say, "Can you meet us at 8:30 our time?" And I was like, "No, that's the freaking middle of the night."
Right. But and you're absolutely right. And I've done a ton of work with Europeans over the years, and they are very used to dealing with the U.S., particularly the East Coast, and so they understand those hours. But you also need to think about, okay, am I a morning person? Am I going to be sharp during that overlapping period?
Yep.
Do I have other commitments with other clients? I mean, are my mornings already all jammed up with other stuff, because they're not going to be available to you in the afternoon in the U.S.
Right.
And so you need to think through just all of those little impacts, and they're things that oftentimes people don't think about until they're actually starting to schedule things once they've become a client. So you want to think about that in advance, whether it's an employee, a contractor, a partner, a vendor, a client, whatever. All of those things, the sooner that you think about those issues and you try to figure out if it's going to be a problem, and if so, how you can address it, the better.
So one of the things that we touched on with employees or contractors is the cultural differences. And I think that's really important to understand as well. And, with Canada, with Western Europe, it's a little, it's not as jolting, but if you're working in Asia, like I have a really good friend I had lunch with last week, and he was telling me this story of how they had a Korean client, and it was a big account. They won this big account, and they were very excited, and they thought, okay, we're going to fly over there, and we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we're going to brainstorm, and we're going to get down into the trenches, and we're going to do this work together, and we're going to have a great time. And it turns out Koreans don't like that. And so they went to do this, and it was very standoffish. They didn't want to participate at all. And what they learned through that experience is that they needed to come a day early and work really hard and do the brainstorming and all the work ahead of time, and then go into the meeting the next day and present 3 ideas. And not only that, but then they would say things like, this idea, could it work in this country? And that meant that they liked that idea, but they would not necessarily say, like we do here, oh my gosh, I love that idea. Let's see if we can do this, this, and this. They say they're very just laid back and sort of, I wouldn't even say laid back, just sort of protective of their feelings and emotions, and do it in a different way. So even thinking about cultural differences from that perspective, how you handle that, and make sure that you know what they are before you go in and you're all ready to brainstorm with them, and they're like, no, we don't do that.
Right. And you need to think about those cultural things, particularly if you're doing anything in the marketing sphere that involves communication, which a lot of marketing does.
Yep.
And so you need to think about how some of your messages may be received. You may need to think about how messages are communicated to you. You need to be conscious of whether English is the first or second language of some of the people that you're working with, if you're an English speaker.
Very
because oftentimes when you're dealing with someone who English is their second language, they may not communicate with the same precision that you're expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And so they may say one thing, they may not mean it in exactly the way it comes across to you. So you need to be, and that skill develops as you work with more folks in that culture, but also the individuals, right? Because everybody is different in how they've learned the language and how they communicate things. And I still remember this time I was on a call with someone, English was their second language. And he said to a woman on the call with us, I say this not to pleasure you.
Oh, jeez.
Everybody started laughing except him.
Right.
Because he didn't realize.
Right.
Because he was a relatively new speaker of the English language. I could not speak his language really at all, however, so I'm in no position to criticize.
Right.
But we need to think about those things, because while that's a humorous example, there are others where you may get the wrong impression based on what someone says, and it may not be as obviously incorrect as that one was.
Poor guy. He was probably like, what? You guys all laughing at him.
and we waited to explain it to him after the call was over, because this was a group call. But and I still remind him of this to this day.
Did you really?
Because it's
Of
funny.
course
It
is
funny.
Yeah.
I mean,
You
and he thinks it's funny as well now.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it was, in the moment, he was confused by why we were all laughing. But you need to think about those things. And
You do.
it's not just sort of cultural sensitivities. There are also regulatory things you need to be thinking about when you're working internationally. You need to be thinking about things like privacy laws, particularly if you're doing anything in the digital sphere and data collection, all that.
Yep.
The rules are different in other countries. What you can and can't do is different. Make sure that you have some local advice on this so that you're not just winging it. Don't just go Google GDPR and figure out what you need to do. Talk with someone at your client, talk with their experts, whatever. Make sure that you are dotting your I's and crossing your T's, because you really don't want to run afoul of some of these, not just privacy laws, but other laws that may be present in other countries, particularly if you're dealing with data of any kind.
Yeah, you have to be really careful of that. And the laws here are definitely different. We like I mentioned, we work with a client in the UK, and for probably 6 months, the first 6 months of the relationship, we went round and round and round about, just sending emails, like blog posts, to people who had opted in. And in the UK, they can't do that. But we kept saying, but the list is in the US. We can do that here. We can and so we had to work through that for the first 6 months of the relationship to help them understand that we had 2 different lists, one for Europe and one for America, and that we could send marketing emails to the US list.
Yep. And it's also, if you're going to be doing work in foreign countries, it can be useful to have a partner in that country.
Mhm.
So, find another agency that works there potentially, particularly if you're just getting started, right? If you're starting to dabble, if you will, in international work, thinking about expanding your markets, you might be better off partnering with somebody so you start to learn some of these things that way, as opposed to, coming in and saying to a potential client, absolutely, I can do all those things, and then learning on the job, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
because that can be a painful experience and a reputation damager potentially for you as well if you're not careful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot to think about. It's not impossible. It's not as overwhelming as this last 20 minutes may make it seem. Like you sort of do the work and tiptoe in and you figure things out. But these are definitely some things you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about payments. You should be thinking about cultural differences. You should be thinking about paid time off, and all of those things that come with it, so that you're ready for it when you're going into it.
And working internationally can be very enriching too. So
Mhm.
I really don't want to scare you off from it, because I love my international clients now. I love working with folks internationally. I'm so glad that I got into that a few years ago much more deeply. And so, it's the kind of thing that can be very rewarding. You just need to know how to do it right.
Right. Totally agree.
So with that, we're going to draw this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast to a close. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And it depends.